Where is this theory prominent? Well, in the early church, in the first few centuries, there seems to be a lot of victory language, a lot of analysis of the cross as having released people from bondage to idolatry, from bondage to serving inferior powers. So Alain describes the early church as having had a Christus Victor theory. And one prominent example, which I'll go into in a minute, of that in the early church is ransom theory. Jesus uses a word to describe what he's there for that becomes very influential as people try to think through how does the battle plan work and how does the cross work. Mark 10:35, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came forward to him and said, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever we ask of you." "Sure. Grant us to sit, one at your right hand and one at your left, in your glory." Now, what were we just talking about last time about earthly kings and how they rule, how worldly power works? James and John want in on the ground floor of this great new kingdom. And Jesus called them to him, called them all to him. And he said, "You know that those who are supposed to rule over the nations lord it over them. And their great men exercise authority over them. But it shall not be so among you. Whoever would be great among you must first be your servant. And whoever would be first among you must be the slave of all. For the Son of Man also came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Now, the early church got to thinking, a ransom? What does that mean? How does the cross work? Well, when do you pay a ransom? You pay a ransom to free someone from a power that holds them in bondage. So the early church put that word to work in crafting a notion of atonement that worked like this. We are all in slavery to the ruler of this world, to the prince of this age, to the one who tempted Jesus in the wilderness and said, "Worship me and I'll give it all to you because it's all mine and I give it to whomever I like." So here's what God does about this, because it's not right that God's own creatures should be held in bondage to the ruler of this world. So he sends his son to become a human being. This puts Satan in a bind. Either he no longer claims all humanity, or he's got to seize Jesus himself. And he tries. His temptations are efforts to co-opt and enslave the Son of God. Jesus' whole career is faced again and again by temptations and tempters. Do this sign and then we'll believe you. He feeds the crowds and they want to make him king, and he has to leave because this isn't the kind of king he is. He's tempted again and again and again to do it the world's way. And finally, in an act of desperation, the devil, through Judas Iscariot and through the rulers, tries to grab him. This sounds like a great story, right? But Satan doesn't have title to the Son of God, and so he defaults. And Jesus' life is a kind of payment that Satan isn't allowed to collect. The incarnation puts the devil in an impossible position. And by grabbing what isn't his, he forfeits his rights to humanity, and humanity is freed. One early church father put it this way: Jesus' humanity is the bait, but Jesus' divinity is the hook by which God reels in the devil. Now that sounds like a great story. But it struck a growing number of theologians as implausible. What rights does the devil legitimately have over humanity when humanity belongs to God anyway? So ransom theory, although it's colorful, although it preaches well, comes to be discarded, especially if you're Anselm, who is the one who really pioneers sacrificial theory, sacrificial atonement theory. So in most theology courses, we will look at ransom theory and we'll chuckle at it and move on. Before we do that, though, I want to stick up for it for a minute. There's something about ransom theory that respects an element of the story that other atonement theories often don't. So I'm not gonna try to sell you on the whole theory itself. For one thing, it requires a really well-developed theology of Satan, and I don't think there's enough biblical material to give us a well-developed theology of the devil. But here's what ransom theory gets. Jesus' sheer, sovereign, obedient goodness keeps manifesting itself in ways that are profoundly threatening to the rest of us. I don't think you don't know this, because you do. I live my life my way, and the way I live my life seems like a pretty good way. But when I'm confronted with Jesus' sheer goodness, it's irritating, isn't it? It's destabilizing. And it leads to a natural impulse to put myself at a distance, to wall off at least parts of my life from his presence. And this is exactly what you see unfold in the Gospels. At first the crowds are like, yeah! And then he sticks around long enough that they start going, wait a minute. I mean, I have to give up that. I have to change that. You mean, what about this? What about this? What about this? And the crowds drop off to smaller and smaller circles of people. In the Gospel of John, what you see all through the storyline is a growing polarization and a shrinking, an ever-shrinking circle of disciples. Until on the cross, there's really basically no one. Jesus' disruptive goodness is an invasion in our world that so threatens to disrupt our world that it eventually pushes us to do something about it. Doesn't it? Newbigin notices that the drama of the cross plays out again and again in every culture that hears the gospel. They don't just go, yay, and then follow. They might go, yay, at first, but then there's pushback. There's pushback from the good people, especially. Maybe the so-called wicked people, maybe they find it refreshing, although they don't seem particularly loyal as the story goes on. But the good people of the society, the good citizens, the righteous ones, they're the ones who are provoked eventually to persecution. Only the persecution fails. It at least fails to falsify the good news. You might wipe out their followers if you're systematic and strategic enough, but you'll never put Jesus back in the grave. You'll never falsify the truthfulness of the good news. This is a different kind of power than worldly power. This is a different kind of kingdom than the conventional kingdoms of this age. That's not coming to be served, but to serve. And this recruiting of people to become servants of one another and servants of the least exposes our so-called goodness, our worldly goodness, as wickedness, as falling short. And it undoes us. It unravels our world. That's a kind of ransom theory.